One of our audience members writes, my parents would be heartbroken if they knew my beliefs have changed. I still love and respect them and can't stand the thought of hurting them. How do I be true to my new beliefs without hurting them?
Right. I know. I feel I love my parents. I'm close to them. I don't want to disappoint them. I don't want them to feel a sense of we wish she was different. We wish she lived something different. And I think that is the hardest part. Maybe the hardest part of parenting is letting go. Maybe the hardest part of becoming an adult is letting go as well, of letting go of the idea that we can please our parents, that we can live to do what they want us to do. And it is the most painful part, this fear of, as accepting as my parents have been, and they have, when your daughter who's about to turn 40 calls you and says, hi, Mom and Dad, I'm getting a divorce, and also I'm not going to be Orthodox anymore. That's not an easy conversation to have. But for all that I know they have been willing to accept the change, of course it hurts them. I know that. And I think it's knowing that that is part of separating. I think about the title of my book, The Book of Separation. There's separation from religion and separation from marriage. I think it's also a separation from who others imagine our lives to be and who we might imagine our own lives to be. And I think with parents, I think that, one way I try to navigate it is to choose to be as respectful as I can, where it doesn't take away from who I am. And so, an example, my 10-year-old daughter, who has a very strong sense of fair, pointed out, when we go to, she calls them Nana and Gaga. So when we go to Nana and Gaga's house, we follow the rules exactly as they do them. She's like, but then, when they come to our house, we also follow the rules exactly like they do it. She's like, it's not fair. And I'm like, you're right. From a technical point of view, you should say, like, at our house, we do it our way. And I hear her point, and I try to affirm them. Like, technically, you're right. You're right, it's not fair. But they're my parents, and so I'm choosing a greater degree of respect. I'm choosing to be respectful of who they are and how they've lived their lives in order to lessen the sense of trespass or hurt for them. And there are things I can't bend on. I can't pretend to believe something I'm not going to do. I'm not going to give an answer to something or do something that I really can't do, but I can alter where I can. And so, for example, at our house on the Sabbath, when my parents come, I feel like you don't have to watch TV right now, guys. You could just turn it off. Or like, we're going to have a traditional Sabbath meal, or I'm not going to cook something on the Sabbath. I'm going to cook it all beforehand, and I'm going to unscrew the light in the refrigerator, and I'm going to do all those things. I'm going to make sure the bathroom lights are where they need to be, out of a sense of love and choosing it. But whoever asked that question, I'm sure many people feel that sense that I think what is the hardest part about leave taking is knowing that in becoming your true self, in being true to what you actually believe, there is pain caused for others. And sometimes I think there's no way around that fact, but it is, I think, one of the painful aspects of the most painful, maybe, part of leaving.
An audience member writes, although I still participate in some family religious events, I still feel like I am on the outside and have a hard time finding something to fill the hole since the church was such a major part in my life. Have you found any kind of community outside of religion to replace what you lost when you left your faith?
Mm-hmm. I think the loss of community is the biggest one. That sense of a ready-made community, a feeling that it wasn't like you had to, where you were going to find friends, like you would move to a place, you would join that synagogue, and the friends would be ready-made. I think one community I do still have is the pluralist Jewish day school that my kids attended. So it's not within an Orthodox Jewish world, but I do still feel some sense of community comes from there. It's a looser community, and it doesn't have that same ready-made feeling. And I still struggle with that question of, I think there's a loneliness in leaving, or a sense of not knowing where exactly I belong. And I think that comes with time. It's sort of a slow recreation of it. I think I was raised to think there's only one community that matters, that religious community is really the real one, and anyone who is not part of that community doesn't sort of count as a friend in a real way. It doesn't feed into that sense of community. And I think for me, some of this has been discovering you can create community for yourself, that no one has a lock on community, that it is harder sometimes. It's not ready-made, but I feel like I've started to develop a community of writers. I think, in all honesty, one of the experiences I've had since my book came out is not a community that's right there, but a community of people on Facebook or through emails who've written to me or who I've written to, a community of people who share this experience of leave-taking. I think that leaving something is enormously lonely, and the reminder that there are other people who share this alleviates that sense of being alone in the world, because there are so many people who feel this way. And I also think some of it is having to rethink what I needed a community for. I think I had such a fear of not belonging to a set community, as if I would be untethered or lost or alone, or I would find myself thinking, but if someone dies, what will happen? I won't have, who will bring me a lasagna? What will I do without that? And I value that kind of community, but I also feel like it's okay.
Vegetarian lasagna.
Oh, it's so funny. For me, I didn't know that lasagna came non-vegetarian. Because you can't mix meat and milk, lasagna is always vegetarian in my world. But that sense that you don't have to have such a tight community either, that I could also be independent, or I can have friends, or I can have multiple interests without that sense of an all-encompassing community around me.
This is a fun question. They're fascinated by the success of so many Jewish people in so many fields like science and the arts, given their small percentage of the world population. Do you have a theory as to why Jews are disproportionately successful in the world? And you may disagree with the premise,
right,
but that's the question.
I don't know. I guess
You can brag.
Well, here's why. I wish I had an answer for it, but I think there is a sense of a disproportionate visibility or success in different fields. The answer I was always told was that because there's such an emphasis on education. I don't know. I don't think it's probably only true of my world. I think that the value of education goes to many different worlds. So,
some might say the adversity,
Maybe, right. I certainly grew up with, the experience of having, my grandparents were all American born, but I had friends whose grandparents were immigrants or great-grandparents were immigrants, in the sense of having to work hard to be accepted, the feeling that you had to work even harder to be accepted because of bias. And so that feeling of trying to make it in America. I think it's a very common immigrant story, that a first generation works very, very hard so that a second generation and third generation can have subsequent success. So I think in some ways the story of American Jews has been sort of a very classic American immigrant story as well, about succeeding and working hard to make it in America in so many ways.
Many want to know what your relationship is with your parents and how they've handled your transition, given that they remain Orthodox.
My parents are fully Orthodox. They're modern Orthodox, and they are very much part of their community. Growing up, we were always part of the community. My parents joked that they were insider outsiders, that they were sort of observant, but they were regarded as a little more liberal than the rest of the community. They were seen as critical of some of the community institutions. And when the Ladies Auxiliary, my first book, came out, and it was seen as critical, people would say, oh, I bet her mom wrote that book. Or, people felt like somehow there was this sort of critical stance that my parents had, and that explained me as a product. And then, I think it's like navigating an ongoing relationship with them. But I do, when I first told my parents, after I sort of dropped that bombshell to them, there was that moment's silence, that pause, sort of the taking it in, and just sort of waiting to hear what they were going to say, that fear that they were going to either try to talk me out of it, or going to be angry at me, that I was going to sort of become a child again in some sense, reprimanded for misbehaving. But they said, we will be here for you. And I felt like those were the most beautiful words a parent can offer a child. I will be here for you wherever this takes you. And so we navigate it. We just sort of, my parents also have, my older brother is part of an ultra-Orthodox community, so very, very strictly observant, where his kids are not really given secular education or exposed to secular studies in any way. And so there's sometimes a sense of whiplash. Or my middle son, who everything is a sports reference, jokingly said, I guess your parents feel like they're 1 for 3 because my sister is the only one who's like them. And my father, said, no, we're 3 for 3 in this sense. So this sense that they could accept difference, could be willing to hear that we are different. And which doesn't say that it's always perfect or always easy. There are moments, my mother will say, oh, did you want to try to observe this? And I'm like, Mom. And she's like, oh, no, never mind, we're not going to go there. There's moments when it becomes complicated, or moments when when I'm aware of this is harder than it used to be, or this is more complicated. But there's no other choice, really, I guess, than to navigate those complications.
Many want to know what you miss about Orthodoxy, if anything.
I do. I do miss things. I miss that feeling of ready-made community, that feeling of, especially around the Sabbath, that you have people over for Friday night dinner and you go there and everyone sort of does the same thing on the Sabbath. You know, when I miss it, I remind myself that I would also want to jump out the window sometimes on those days as well. And so I try to idealize what I miss. I miss, you know, I don't know that I felt it for many, many years, but I miss the feeling that there were answers, that the world did not feel enormously complicated, and that things that were so painful and hard did not have answers that anyone could supply to me. I miss that sense that someone could say, no, you don't have to worry about that. Or I miss the feeling that if I prayed for someone I loved not to be sick, that I could somehow have an impact on that. You know, that sense of, I wish it were true. I wish I could affect the world by that. I don't think it's true. And that, I think, has a loss. Sometimes that sense of not feeling that I can control or have an impact on things that will happen to all of us. And so I think those sort of things I do miss. They come with complications, of course. To feel that you can control something when really you can't is not necessarily a gift. But I miss at least the presumption of that sometimes.
Someone wants to know if you feel like you're at peace now, and if so, what brings you peace?
Right. I feel more at peace, I would say. I feel more, you know, maybe we're always moving towards a greater sense of things as opposed to any set arrival. I feel more at peace with mostly that feeling of not pretending, with not having to do that internal self-censoring that I was so good at automatically doing, of thinking, well, don't say it like that because that sounds like you don't think it, so reshift it. And I feel more at peace as a writer in being able to say what I really think, that freedom that comes from not having to put forth something that I don't really think, or not having to try to fit into a community, not having to worry, oh no, will I be seen here on a Friday night, or I was seen in this restaurant, oh no, what will they say? The letting go of that feels like a relief, because they can read, you know, you no longer have to worry about being seen driving on the Sabbath when you've written an article in the New York Times about driving in the Sabbath. It just takes away the fear of, it's outing yourself in the most public way possible. And so I think there is a greater sense of peace with that. I do still wrestle with it. I wrestle with the questions, of, you know, what my kids being raised in two worlds, with how it is for my kids to go back and forth between a father who is Orthodox on the weekends. They spend half their weekends with him where they observe, and we're with me where we observe. The weekends the kids are with me, we do the Sabbath in a sort of loose way, it's sort of in a nominal way, but not according to all these strict rules. And so I worry for them about that. I worry about, I think the fact that that it's a question of, will these relatives talk to me, or will these people talk to me? I've gotten much better at navigating it. It used to be that going into the kosher bakery on a Friday to buy challah, the traditional bread, was something that would, you know, I would have to sort of sit myself down beforehand and think, okay, you can do this, you know, it's fine. Someone might not talk to you, or is going to give you that like icy, hi, you know, look, you know, that I know so well. You know, it becomes easier to navigate it, but those are things that still pierce that sense of being fully at peace. And I think maybe the notion that we're ever fully at peace, I don't know, do you feel at peace? I'm gonna turn it back at you, John. I'm gonna ask you, to that sense, is there ever a full arrival maybe? Maybe you're always moving toward or something. There's never a full peace.
Yeah, I'm asking the question.
Oh, sorry, okay.
No.
Anyone else?
No, if you guys want sort of like a year's worth of therapy for $20, there's a book called The Happiness Trap, or even a better version of it is called The Illustrated Happiness Trap. And to just summarize the happiness trap in less than a minute, it's the idea that the pursuit of happiness actually leads to more sadness and less happiness. And that's why I love secular Buddhism so much, because it starts with the premise that life is suffering. And then anything that happens that's positive is kind of just a surprise and is a bonus. But what we know for sure is that the active pursuit of happiness brings sadness. And that's called attachment, and that's what Buddhism sort of cautions against. So we start becoming at peace when we let go of the illusion that we can be happy.
Right. I guess living is grappling. I mean, we're always, grappling with things and changing. We don't get to predict what the thing that we will be dealing with tomorrow, what that will be. We don't know yet. That you're always sort of asked to navigate new things. And maybe, I guess, to maybe moving away from the notion of being at peace and more towards being able to, maybe I would choose authenticity over peace, the idea of being able to navigate those things that come up with my full self, as opposed to any fixed sense of now I am who I am. And knowing that, I've changed in the past 20 years, I will continue to change, and the people I love around me will change as well.
One question from the audience, I'm going to rephrase it just a tiny bit. They've perceived from you this idea that in especially Orthodox Judaism, belief is a lot less important than behavior and belonging. That it's mostly about just living the laws and kind of keep your beliefs to yourself. I remember in the podcast, you talking about this idea of like asking someone if they really believe something is almost, you get kind of a scratched look like, why? That's kind of weird, you're even asking me about belief. So I guess the question comes in two parts. I think they're envying that you were part of a tradition where belief kind of really didn't matter too much. Mm-hmm. So they're wondering, how could you leave? You had it so good, right? You didn't even have to believe it. You just did it. And
toilet paper.
Go ahead.
Having a tear of the toilet paper as well. There's a trade-off of that.
So it was the behavior that became hard. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. Or the need to feel that the behavior mattered, to feel that this tiny action has enormous theological consequence, or that whether I tore the toilet paper or not mattered in some sense to a God, or mattered to how I fitted into the community, or to feel that my every action had to live according to this rule or that rule, that whether I washed the dishes with this sponge or that sponge mattered enormously. And so in some ways I envy the idea of the big abstractions of belief. I feel like I'd rather have a conversation about big theological questions than the kind of conversations I had so often about where, I used the meat sponge to wash the milk dish, and now is the milk dish not kosher anymore, and do I have to put it away, or is there a way to make it kosher? I mean, that was the kind of religious question I might ask, as opposed to is there God in the world, or what does it mean to be good? I almost was hungry for those large questions in a sense.
The second part of this question was, can you comment on sort of the situation that many here are in? You remember that temple? We're at Temple Square, and Tova's like, can we go in that temple and check it out? And I'm like, it's a little complicated, actually. Right. It's not that easy. So I explained to Tova kind of what you had to do to get in, and you have to affirm all these beliefs. And they're basically saying, help, not only do we have to do these crazy rules, but we actually have to affirmatively assent to the belief code that they want us to believe. And they're kind of saying, what do you think about not only having to do the crazy behaviors, but to have to affirm the beliefs too?
Right. I mean, I think there's something soul destroying about having to say you think you believe something you really don't, or having to say it repeatedly, or to live in a way that says I affirm this or I believe this when you know yourself not to. And I think maybe that experience more than any other is why it is so hard to live in this middle ground, to live closeted in some sense. And I think there was never a moment where in Orthodox Judaism, you don't have no one asks you do you believe this, do you believe that? It is about observance. And so you sort of are, your belief is sort of assumed. It's assumed you, of course, believe this is true, and your observance is supposed to be a reflection of that. But it's not, I don't think I was ever outwardly asked, do you believe in this? Or do you, can you state your allegiance to it? It was just sort of the assumption that we were all part of this world, and so of course we did. And so, it was one of the things that was interesting for me today, the sense about how you're asked to state you believe something. And I always feel like, the answer I would have given, even when I was part of the Orthodox world, would have been so complicated. Well, it depends how you define belief, or define God, or define, redefining every word, because it would have been hard to give straight-on answers to those things. And so do people offer affirming answers when they don't really feel that? Is that to say?
A lot of heads are nodding.
Right. And so what is it? It does something to you. I mean, I think it does something. I felt this way in my marriage, certainly, but I think even within my community, that the knowledge that what I really thought was somehow dangerous to my own life, or if I were to say what I really thought, I could not remain where I was. I mean, for me, that, in some sense, coming to know that was how I knew I couldn't stay anymore, because I couldn't reconcile the fact that if I wanted to be true to myself, I was somehow betraying my own world.
We have a question about hair.
Oh, let's talk about hair.
Yeah. So is it true that Orthodox Jewish women have to have their heads shaved by a rabbi when she gets married? Then you have to wear a wig. If yes, do you shave it after that? How did that make you feel? Jill.
Okay. So I guess there's a notion of hair covering in the Orthodox Jewish world. It stems from, sort of the way like Talmudic rabbinic reasoning works. There's a passage in the Bible, the 5 books of Moses, that talks about the adulterous woman and says you uncover her hair as part of sort of the temple punishment for her. And so from the fact that you uncover her hair, the oral tradition, which is part of Jewish law, deduced from that therefore we assume that all women covered their hair. And so we therefore assume that all women must cover their hair. And so Jewish law becomes sort of codified from a biblical phrase that's interpreted in the Talmud, which is one of the Jewish books of oral law, and then is interpreted more and more by subsequent generations. And so and that's how Jewish law sort of takes effect. And so from that one phrase, there was this notion, or a law, that married Orthodox women covered their hair, that Orthodox women's hair was considered an abomination, or it was considered nakedness. It was as naked as any other private part of her body. And so the tradition always for Orthodox women was to cover their hair. And so there were different ways women covered their hair, and many women wore scarves or kerchiefs, but there became a phenomenon. I don't know what generation. I want to say in the 19th century, for women to cover their hair with wigs, sort of that if you had to always cover your hair, you may as well have a wig to do it, because it looks better, or it's more, doesn't quite stand out as much. And so that phenomenon went forward to contemporary Orthodox world, where people cover their hair with gorgeous human hair wigs that you would never even know are wigs. But the idea was you are still technically covering your hair. And some women, there are many different ways of hair covering, but for most women in the Orthodox world, that was considered sort of the accepted practice. Some women did not, and certainly as you went to the more liberal edge of that world, people did not. So on the far right edges of Orthodoxy, women did shave their head. It was not shaved by a rabbi, but usually a mother would shave the daughter's hair the morning after a wedding, and with the idea that if hair is immodest, that no one should ever see your hair. And so, there's a novel called The Romance Reader by Pearl Abraham that has a searing scene of a daughter having her head shaved by her mother. And so in my world, I was going to cover my hair because I wanted to be, mostly because I wanted to be regarded as someone who would cover her hair. But I was going to do it in this very liberal way, what I viewed as a very liberal feminist way, and that I was not going to wear a full wig, I was going to wear a fall. And so a fall is sort of like a demi-wig, and I was like, I'm a feminist, I am wearing a fall, not a wig. And it starts here, and you pull your hair over it, and I think my entire engagement was spent, searching New York City for a fall that was as curly as my own hair. It seemed that no one could possibly make, any kind of fake hair as curly as mine. But I did it with the idea that this is what you do if you're a married woman. And some women cover their hair with just baseball hats, or some women don't cover all of their hair. But hair is a big thing in the Jewish world. Women's hair is considered somehow this lightning rod of conversation. And so if you wanted to gauge how religious a woman is, you would say, oh, does she cover her hair? Or if you want to gauge how religious a man is, you would say, does his wife cover her hair? And so it's a real litmus test and a real marker of where you fall in that world.
Oh, I wasn't.
Oh,
okay. I was saying, Dave was texting me.
Okay.
Stop texting me, Dave.
Okay.
You're coming soon. My wife's yelling at me because I haven't asked her question yet. No, she's not yelling. Just kidding, sweetie. This is Margie. Apparently, Delins have gifts for compound questions. So this is like 4 questions, okay? So I'm curious. Margie's writing. She started a blog. She writes, I'm curious about the difference in the writing process for writing this memoir compared to her fiction books? Was it more painstaking in trying to consider everyone involved? Did you feel vulnerable while writing? How does it feel to have released something so personal to the world?
My first 3 books were all novels, and the first 2 wrestle so much with orthodoxy and with what it means to belong to a community and what it means to believe or not believe. You know, my second novel has a character who describes himself as an observant agnostic. And I was like, no, it's not me, of course. It's, these characters. It's other people. I'm just writing about other characters. And of course, you're always in your books. And now when I look back at these first 2 books, I feel like, oh, the religious questions were all over the page. Of course, it was right there in the book. But the nice thing about fiction is that, you're there and you're not there. That character, that observant agnostic, is me, yeah, but he was also a 60-year-old lawyer, man. So it wasn't me at the same time. And so I think what I love about fiction is you get to tease out questions and explore them through other characters. And in terms of your own sense of exposure, it's almost like a game of hide and seek with the reader where, it's you and it's not you at the same time. And so in deciding to write a memoir, I never thought I would write a memoir. Partially because I thought I never want to be when I was Orthodox, I thought I couldn't really write a memoir about this because I don't really want to go there. I don't want to ask myself those hard questions. And to write about it means you have to be willing to go to those hard spaces. And I sort of wrote the memoir almost by accident. Even after this experience of leaving, I thought that somehow it would become part of my fiction. I thought that I would use the material in some way, but I didn't think I was ever really going to write about my own self. It feels so exposing and so vulnerable, especially when writing about religion. There's such, it brings out people's sort of anger and their responses. It's threatening in so many ways, and I didn't really want to subject myself to that. And so I was very afraid of it. But I wrote an essay. I thought, well, I'll just play with it. And I wrote about my Orthodox Jewish divorce ceremony to get, it's not just having a civil divorce, but there's a religious ceremony in which you are given the official divorce document from your husband, and there's sort of a careful choreography you have to do. And for me, that was really the moment of knowing that I was leaving not just a marriage, but I was leaving this religious world. I wrote the piece, mostly thinking it was probably going to be for myself. I really was very afraid about the kind of anger you get sent back at you from the world when you write critically about religion. And I wrestled with it, and I kept working on it. I couldn't put the piece aside. And right before my 3rd book came out, my editor asked me if I had any personal essays they could send out. They sort of like to do that before a book comes out to kind of publicize your work. And I was like, well, I have this thing. I have this essay. And I debated about doing it or not. And then I sent it to the New York Times, mostly thinking, what are the odds anyway that they would publish it? It felt like such a long shot that it almost felt safe. And then an hour later, I got a response from one of the Times editors saying, we love this and want to publish it. And my first thought was to say, oh, I was just kidding. I can't, how could I write about, religious transformation when it was so new, in such a public venue? And I did not pull it back as I had the urge to do. And I really had this sense of, it really felt like a coming out in so many ways, like a being willing to say, like, yes, I am not part of my own world anymore. I'm leaving this world. And when the essay came out, I had that renewed sense of, why did I do this? And I also, within an hour or 2 of it going live on the Times website, I had hundreds of emails from people, and they were people sharing their own stories of, some were divorced, but really the vast majority were from people from all religious backgrounds, from so many different religious worlds, people who were grappling with being part of a religious community, or people who had left. And it made me remember why I had wanted to be a writer in the first place. It made me realize that when you are willing to be vulnerable, when you take that step towards exposing your own wrestling and your own leave-taking, it is what enables other people, I think, to connect with their own stories and to share those stories. And so it was what made me decide to write the book. I really was extremely nervous. And before the book came out, to say I was nervous is such a sweet understatement. I was deeply, crazily anxious about what it would mean to have this story be in the world, and to know that you get reactions from people, you get comments, you get, people are very bothered by this certain people are very bothered by this kind of story. And so I knew that I was going to have to grow a thick skin in some ways, or to learn that you never read the comments, to not read certain things, that I didn't have to read everything that was said about me. It didn't make it true just because someone wanted to write something hateful. And in terms of exposing other people, I felt such a strong sense of responsibility as a writer. In fiction, even if I was using someone's story, it was disguised, it was set in a different place, I gave a story I heard as a child to someone 40 years older, that it wasn't always traceable, and it stopped being the actual person. But in memoir, it was real people. It's not just my parents and my siblings, my children, but my ex-husband. No one wants an ex-wife who's a memoirist. It is on no one's wish list in a divorce. And I knew that, and I understood that. And so I felt that I had a responsibility to decide what would stay private, to know that not everything about our marriage was going to be in this book, that there were many things that I was going to keep out. And there were stories that did not belong to me. There were parts of the book that, if I were writing a novel, I would say, oh, this is interesting, let's really go here, let's open this up. One example is my sister was not married until the year I got divorced. She got married in her very late 30s, which in the Orthodox Jewish world is something of a crisis or tragedy, to be unmarried at such a late age. And it was always, oh my God, she's not married, this thing. And she has her own experience of that and what that means to her. I felt like that was not my story to tell. I told about the fact that she got engaged over the course of the year, and we went to her wedding as part of this year. But the real experience of what it meant to be 37 and Orthodox and not married was not something that belonged to me. And so I wanted to be careful about what was mine and what wasn't mine. And also, I think, to write from a place of generosity. There are certain people who you feel like, oh, here's my chance, never liked you, let's, go after you. But I feel like it's not the best writing. Life is more complex than, good guys and bad guys, and good characters and bad characters. And so I always wanted to force myself to really open myself in some sense, to write from the most generous place, even about things that were hurtful to me or that still are painful.
I'm going to give Margie a shameless plug. One of the things I love about Tova is she represents sort of rebuilding a life after you've been down a very Orthodox path, and I'm just super proud of Margie. She's finding new ventures and finding new ways to kind of learn about herself and to share herself with the world. So she has a new website called beautyinthenow.org where she's blogging. She actually got her own Facebook account so she could promote her blog. And she's even doing some coaching for those who are struggling in faith crisis, raising kids, in marriages, having healthy marriages. She's great with fitness and health and nutrition, all sorts of things. So that's my shameless plug for my sweet wife. Check it out if you're interested, beautyinthenow.org. So many questions. All right, Dave, one more and then you're next, okay? Sid wants to know, what are your spiritual beliefs now?
That's a good question.
There's an assumption there.
Maybe I'll divide the two words up, spiritual and beliefs. I do feel a sense of spiritual connection to the world. I feel a sense of beauty in the world. I feel a sense of goodness among people, of wanting to be part of gentleness in the world, of kindness, of wanting to choose kindness when I can, to choose the benefit of the doubt when I can, to open myself to experience, to open myself to the fact that I don't know all the answers, that the world is vast and moving and immense. I would sort of group that as my spirituality in the world, my sense of how to live in the world. I don't think it has religion or God as its basis. I don't think I would place God in that equation. I don't have that belief. So I think my beliefs stem more, I don't know what category to place those in. Someone once said to me, are you a secular humanist? I was like, oh, that sounds cool. Like, what is that? I don't really know exactly. But maybe to sort of live outside of any set defined world, or having to name belief system in that way. And to say that, after coming from a world where it was so defined. It wasn't just that I was Jewish. It wasn't just that I was an Orthodox Jew. It wasn't just that I was a modern Orthodox Jew, but I was, a liberal modern Orthodox Jew. I was this kind of Jew. There's something nice about not having to define it and leaving it open in some sense to a not knowing and to an interest in learning. And one of the things I've embarked on recently is I realize how little I know of science, how crazy that is. And so just reading, just trying to read about science, to learn more about the physical world around me, and feeling that immense sense of wonder and mystery, and to feel that sense of appreciation of the beauty of our world without going to a religious origin for it.
Beautiful. Just so you guys know, we're going to go about 20 more minutes. We're super grateful that you're here. We brought her all this way. And I want to get as many questions in as we can, but so grateful that you're all here, loving these questions. You guys know that we tend to go longer rather than shorter on Mormon Stories. If you need to go, don't feel bad, but we hope as many of you can will stick around, but we're going to do, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure.
She's got a red eye tonight, so we're going to be taking her to the airport around 10 o'clock tonight. So it's going to be great. All right, David. For those of you who don't know, David's been on Mormon Stories. He and his sweet wife, and a really courageous episode. So check out the Udis. How do you pronounce it? Udis. It's a great episode. But David, why don't you come up and ask your question, please?
Hi, Tova.
Hi.
So I was a little hesitant to ask this question just because I'm a little, can you hear me? I'm a little concerned that it might be hard for you to relate to, but I'm going to do my best. And hopefully I can articulate myself well. Sometimes that's hard for me too. So my experience with Mormonism, I was raised in a very Orthodox, believing Mormon home, but also in a very abusive, dysfunctional Mormon home. And in Mormonism, it's very much about the wholesome, sort of pure, functional, or at least the appearance of that type of a family. And my family wasn't that. And that really, as a youth, that really affected my identity. Something I didn't realize till I grew up and reflected on it. So even though I was raised in a very Orthodox, believing Mormon home that was dysfunctional, that seeing this facade of, and maybe not even always a facade, but sometimes a reality of very functional, wholesome Mormon families, and me knowing mine wasn't that, sort of caused me to internalize that and believe at a very deep level that I was the other. I was not that. I was not, and so, as a youth, I was involved in a lot of substance abuse and a lot of criminal behavior. Some of my closest friends, when I was growing up, I have a close friend that passed away from a drug overdose, another friend that spent a lot of years in prison and has since passed away. So there was a lot of that was just kind of the stew I was brought up in. And as a young adult, I became very active and believing. I always believed, but I became very active and had spiritual experiences around the church. And to me, that was linked to my ability to succeed and thrive at all as a human being and to stay sober. It affected my decision to go to college and to get a degree, to marry a wife who I'm still married to there's a functional type of that I believe was a functional type of person. And when I lost belief, all of that kind of came into question for me. And it took me a long time to sort of rebuild that and reframe a new way of finding spirituality and finding a way to function in a healthy way as an adult and as a parent. So I know that I just explained a lot, but I just wonder, did you, either personally or within your community, did you observe anything like that or that can relate to that in any way?
I think I grew up with the notion that if you were part of this religious world, you were exempt from the problems of the outside world. You might hear about things like abuse or, alcoholism, divorce, all those issues, but those were other people's problems. That we, in our cocooned world, were somehow shielded because religion was somehow supposed to shield you from any of those other problems. It was always very easy to be like, oh, see, if you step outside this is what happens to you. And so there was a way in which it was this almost false sense of comfort. And then, of course, you would hear things that didn't quite match, the sense of, rumblings of abuse or questions about behaviors or things like that. But there was always this gap between the way the world was supposed to look and what actually went on in people's lives. And I think for me, one of the think one of the most eye-opening things was realizing that being religious did not shield you from the outside world, that it did not guarantee that your children would turn out perfectly, that all marriages were happy. I thought that no one who was Orthodox got divorced because you were guaranteed a sort of happiness. And I think for me, ultimately became almost separating out happiness and stability in family and functional marriages from a religious world, and realizing that, religious world might promise that, but there are other ways toward it. And that sense that, I think people gain things from being part of religious worlds. I think people can gain a sense of family or connection. Religion helps people in some ways, but it's not the only way to arrive at those things. It's not the only way to have that sense. We saw the video today. What
on Temple Square.
Temple Square, about sort of a happy family. And, we were talking about it afterwards, and I said, oh, you could just put yarmulkes on those family members, and it would be the same message of our world, that if you are in this, you will have these happy families, and the implication being if you're not, you won't. And I just think it's not true. The problems that we all, that are part of our world plague us wherever we are, and that I think, I certainly felt when I got divorced, I felt like, the term broken home followed me. I carried that term in my head. Or someone referred to someone else as a child of divorce. And I just cringed, that sense that if you step out of this, you are somehow at risk, or your children are at risk. And I think so much for me, of my own experience the past few years, is rejecting that idea that religion equals safety, and being outside of it equals dangers and the, societal ills, that they cross every boundary and every part of it, and that your own, the successes you describe in your own life, or the transformations, can come from you, that you create those things for yourself. They're not something that religion is responsible for, but your own choosing them, and that we each get to choose and build our own lives. And that, I think that fallacy that happiness is only found in religion. That was how I sort of read the message of those videos, that religion creates happy families. And one of the things I felt like saying was, but you can have happy families other places too. It's not the only place to have them.
Thank you. Thanks, David. So I mentioned to you before that Judaism sort of has had many branches or sects in the way that it's developed to sort of, you can sort of pick your flavor of Judaism and join that sect. In Mormonism, we don't quite have that. We do have, fundamentalist Mormons, but there haven't been, and we have Community of Christ, but most traditional LDS church members, might not consider that as even a viable option. So really what we have is we have a traditionally very Orthodox religion where people are either in or out. And then over the past 10 or 20 years, we have this emerging group of kind of progressive or liberal Mormons that are trying to sort of carve a reform Mormonism within the fold instead of breaking off and starting their own. So the question is, and I think we're going to know the answer, are more liberal Orthodox Jewish people looked down on by more strictly observant Jewish people? How do people at different levels of observance relate to one another in Judaism?
Right. The answer is probably, what am I going to say? I'm going to let you answer for me. Are people in the more liberal stream looked down on by people in the more traditional worlds? And yes. Yes. So, it's certainly not just within Orthodoxy, but, growing up, I basically thought that Orthodox was a synonym for religious. And so if you were Orthodox, you were religious. If you were, there were conservative Jews and Reform Jews. To me, they were I guess, part of our religious world. Maybe it was sort of like you couldn't really go into a conservative synagogue because you would give credence to that belief that was obviously wrong. You couldn't give any sense of validity to it. So there was always that sense that anyone not like me is wrong. There was also someone in the other direction. In my modern Orthodox world, anyone who was right-wing, further to right, was crazy. Anyone who was to the left was irreligious. So only just like me was right. As long as you were exactly the way I was, that was the only truth. And I think, and certainly the culture wars within the Orthodox community right now are very much are between liberal Orthodoxy, sometimes it's referred to as open Orthodoxy now, and and more right-wing Orthodoxy. Those issues tend to be around issues of women's involvement. And even within modern Orthodoxy, there is a culture war about women becoming rabbis and the role women can play. There are many culture wars within the Orthodox community about treatment of the gay lesbian community, where that fits in, about anything that doesn't fit into sort of normative notions of who you're supposed to be. There's a constant culture war battle going on about acceptance, about not just disparaging language, but about, just sort of flat out rejection and families rejecting them. There's also a culture war going on in the Orthodox world around people who leave Orthodoxy. It's considered a crisis, and how do we address the crisis of of people like me who leave, and what do we do about them, and how do we pull them back in, and how do we convince them of the error of their ways? So there's always that sense of culture war, but there is the sense of delegitimizing viewpoints that differ from a more right-wing Orthodox perspective, and saying that they are beyond the pale, or they are not authentic Judaism, or they distort true practice. They are letting secular values shape their Judaism as opposed to holding strong to the true faith. And so those are, when I was part of that world, I was very much riled up by those sort of culture wars, and was very much sort of part of a conversation around them, particularly about women's roles in the Orthodox world.
Many people want to know if you ever attempted to sort of evangelize friends or family or former church members or even rabbis with your new version of secularism, or whatever you want to call it, or free inquiry. And if you don't, how do you muster the restraint to not want to kind of be a missionary for your new position?
Right. Sometimes there are moments of, biting one's tongue, of deciding, is this a good conversation to have or not? In some ways, because of my book, I feel so out there with what I think. I feel like I don't have to even, people are like, oh, we already know what you think, don't worry about that. We know exactly what you think. When I went to visit my son at his yeshiva in Israel, I knew that, of course, his rabbis knew that I had written this book. And so there's the strangeness of it. There's the strangeness of feeling like you can't just kind of slink in, but people are like, oh, we know about you. We know who you are in this world. And so I don't feel an urge to evangelize or to sway in any ways. I feel more an urge to be able to say what I think, and to be able to not have to pretend. And so there are times I don't. There are times I choose not to, my mother and I have like an ongoing little joking dialogue about it. She'll tell me something, and she'll say, oh, I know you think this is crazy, right? And I'll be like, no, tell me. She's like, you think it's crazy? I'm like, it's okay, you could tell me anyway. Like, this knowing that we have a gap in belief, but yeah, I don't know. I guess I feel like there's a difference between sharing your own honest view and trying to convince, because one of the things I really disliked in the Orthodox world, or people who try to convince, people who evangelize to become, Judaism doesn't believe in proselytizing outside of Judaism, but there's certainly a movement within Orthodoxy it's called kiruv, which means to bring you close, to draw people back in, and to sway people towards belief. And one of the things I would often say in response to that is, how would you feel if I were to do that to your children? If I were to try and convince them of the values of secularism, or if I were to poke some holes in that belief? Where is it appropriate to do it, and where is it not? And where does respect need to go both ways? But it is sometimes hard to, I think now that my book came out, I feel a sense of relief, because I think for a long time I felt like I was hiding it. I felt like I was privately thinking these things, and maybe when I was inside it was when I most felt the need to talk about it. One of the scenes in my book that I most enjoyed writing, but that felt the most nerve-wracking, was a scene where I was invited to talk to a panel of Orthodox rabbis. It's called the Orthodox Forum, which is sort of like a gathering of modern Orthodox rabbis who address a different subject every year. And this year they were talking about religion and culture. And so I was invited as sort of a practicing Orthodox Jewish writer to come talk about whether there was a struggle between art and religion. And at first, they sent me a series of questions, and at first I wrote back answers sort of that I knew they wanted to hear. No, there's no struggle whatsoever, that I love using Jewish sources in my writing, that, no problem here, don't worry about art. Art is not going to threaten you in any way. And then they sent me back my responses to proofread, along with the other Orthodox artists' responses, and I hated them. I felt I hated everyone else's, I have to say too, but I mostly hated my own. I hated the falseness. I felt like I was telling them what they wanted to hear, and in doing so, I was just requiring other people to pretend also, that when you pretend, you invite pretending from other people. And so I asked if I could revise my answers. And I was so at the end. If they had known where I was, they would never have invited me to this event. I was at that like dangling by a thread moment. My marriage was falling apart. I was trying desperately to finish my third novel, wrestling with the fact of my own inhibition in writing. And I wrote freely. I wrote what I really thought. And there's something so exhilarating and honest about saying, there is a problem. There is a problem with being an Orthodox artist, that I value artistic freedom, and I am not willing to change my work so that it adheres to a religious notion. Or one of the questions was, would you ever ask a rabbi permission for any of your work? And I was like, no, I would never, ever do that, because I would never recognize a rabbinic authority over my creative work. And I decided that I was just going to say it. And they asked me if I would come speak at the conference. And I was like, oh, okay, could I not just say it in writing, but could I say it, in person? And I decided to do it. I felt like, there I felt the need to say it. I felt like if I belong to a world where I cannot say what I really think, then I don't really belong to this world. And so I went, and it was, there's a room of 100 people. There were probably 5 women in the room. It was mostly men. And, you've got to get a series of questions. And so the questions were they'd all read my responses. So I felt like, okay, there's no backing down anyway. But there were questions about the role of art and the role of freedom and the role of personal autonomy to make your own choices versus adhering to religious law. And I really felt like it was one of the first times that in public, I just said what I thought. I mean, I no longer felt the need to say something so that I could remain inside. And it was sort of thrilling, I guess maybe an odd place to decide to really go to let it rip. But I felt like I could not pretend for one more minute. And one of the things someone said to me was, are you saying that you are somehow outside of religious law? And I said, I'm not answering from a perspective of religious law. I said, I'm answering as a writer, and that is what I am, and that I believe in the idea of freedom, and that I have my artistic freedom. And I said, there had been all this conversation about art and how we can use art to draw kids into religion, how we can, change the music, change the lyrics of hip-hop music so that it's had a religious message, and then kids would see, oh, we're cool too, you don't need to go outside, we have all this inside. And I said, art is not about affirming. Art is not about making you feel better about your own world. That art is really about asking questions. And that sometimes when you ask questions, you don't always end up where you began. That you do open the door. And art is designed to make you think and to change you. And I was changing and was willing to say that. Ironically, it happened to take place at a religious institution. They had a student art show. And so there was a big sign behind me that said, think outside the box. And I just said, it's not a slogan. You can't say think outside the box and not mean it. Thinking outside the box means sometimes you leave the box. And so there I felt the need to really, I don't know if evangelize is the word, but I felt like because I was so often asked to pretend, that there I felt the need to really say.
I like that. Okay, we just a couple more quick questions, and we'll close. There are some people here who are kind of stuck in their transition. They've hit kind of a rut. They feel like they missed out on so much, and now they're just kind of feeling stuck. What advice would you give someone who's feeling stuck?
And feeling stuck in moving forward from that in-between space?
Yeah.
I mean,
they've left, but maybe they're not thriving. Maybe they're in a rut. Maybe they're depressed.
Right. And one of the things I felt was that you can leave, but not really leave. You can let go of, I felt that way for a long time. I feel it less now, but I did feel that sense that I had let go of community and ritual, but I still had the hard parts in my head. I still felt that I was bad. The irony of my name, Tova, means good in Hebrew. And I felt like it was sort of the perfect and the worst name my parents could have given me, because I felt like in leaving, I couldn't move past the emotional state. I might have no longer observed, but inwardly I was still in the place of asking myself the question again and again of, was I good or bad? What did it mean to no longer be this? And somewhere along the way, somewhere in the midst of leaving, a few years into leaving, I realized it wasn't just enough to ask myself the same question, have a different answer. It wasn't just I could say, do I keep kosher or not? Am I observing or I'm not observing? But I had to ask myself a different set of questions. I had to stop asking myself whether I adhered or not, or whether I was good or not, and almost dispense with those questions and come up with new questions about who do I want to be in the world, and what do I really care about, and what do I think about. I think with leaving, I think it's so important to be gentle with yourself about the fact that leaving is so hard. It's leaving everything, and it's leaving an entire world. And I think when I felt impatient with myself of why am I still taking back roads on Friday night when I'm going to drive? Why am I still sneaking around so that people I know don't see me? I felt sort of ashamed of my own, leave. What kind of leave taking is this when you're still sneaking around or still looking over your shoulder? And I just felt like I was going to be patient with myself to be in that space, that sort of desert space between places where I didn't yet know who I was, and it was not yet clear who I was going to become. And maybe being patient with yourself, knowing that, to know that, there are people in my life who I think did not understand why I had such a hard time with leaving. They felt like, well, you weren't happy in it, so you should be so thrilled not to be part of it now. I was like, but no, that's not at all what it's like. It felt like you let go of it one piece at a time, and it's like snipping every thread again and again. And I think so much of it was just being willing to sit with the sadness of it, and to sit in the discomfort, and to sit in the pain, to say that there is tremendous pain here in leaving, and there's no way around the pain. There's no way but then to almost accept the pain, to sort of embrace the sense of I'm doing something that is really radical to my own sense of who I am in the world. And also, there's something that floats around the ultra-Orthodox community about the idea of, leaving, the it gets better movement. There's sort of a Yiddish play on it, it gets besser, which is like a Yiddish version of saying that. But this idea that it gets better, that the initial leave taking, it doesn't stay that way, and a year goes by and it's a little easier, and 3 years go by, 4 years go by, now I can drive right through the center of my town on Friday night. I do sometimes look down, or I sometimes feel like I wish I had like a hood I could wear on my sweatshirt, but I'm still gonna do it, I'm gonna drive. And it's like those incremental movements towards something, as opposed to feeling like I need to have a clean break in any way.
I'm gonna have you read a little passage, then I'm gonna have Darla ask her question, then I'm gonna maybe have you read a final passage. Sure. Is that okay? So this book is well marked because both Margie and I read this book, but there's actually a page with 10 stars on it. Okay. So I'm gonna have you read the 10-star page. Is that okay?
It doesn't surprise me what it is.
What's that?
Yeah, I'm curious what it's going to be.
And I think it ties into what you just said, but I want to get you reading just a few passages. So start here and then finish after the 10 stars are done.
Okay, all the photos? Okay.
We are on the bottom of page 47.
Okay, and this scene takes place in visiting my parents in Memphis, where I grew up, in my childhood home. Okay. And this is looking at family photos of my brother, who's ultra-Orthodox, and my sister and me. All these photos are not just family memories, but photographic evidence of the presumed threats to modern Orthodoxy, which views itself as being under siege from the right, from the left, and from inside. There's the problem of kids rejecting the so-called pick-and-choose laxness of modern Orthodoxy and becoming right-wing Orthodox. There's the problem of kids falling through the holes created by the relative openness and becoming non-observant. And if that's not bad enough, there's the problem of singles who don't get married at the conventional time and who linger for years, feeling the community has no place for them. Now my siblings and I represent all of these. My parents, I imagine, must sometimes feel like they have whiplash from the varying paths we have taken. But even so, they have maintained this middle ground. They believe you can remain strictly Orthodox without being a separatist. You can grapple with modern ideas, engage in art and science, believe in a limited feminism, if you must, although not so much that it pulls you away. Teach your children to span two worlds and trust they can navigate between them. But here lay the dilemma. If you allowed yourself to be a critical thinker, was religion exempt from this examination? If you raised children to think for themselves, what did you do if they thought in ways that were foreign to you? If you believed in free choice, what did you do if your children chose something else? Do you know what it feels like to live something you don't believe? I ask my parents when I come back into the kitchen. Each time I say this outright, I leave a little more. To leave a marriage, to leave a religion, you never go just once. You have to leave again and again.
That was beautiful.
Thank you.
I read your book, and I had all my friends and a lot of my family read it. So
Thank you so much.
it meant a lot to me. And I don't want to take away from that with this silly question, but it's a silly question. So my son had his DNA done, and it came back that we are 2% Ashkenazi Jewish. And I said, yay, we're part Jewish, that's great. And he said, Mom, that just means you're German. He said, you can't be part Jewish. It's like saying you're 2.6% Mormon. Because Judaism is a religion, not a race. And I said, well, I think it's both. And so we had this argument for a while, and I don't know which is true.
My husband did 23andMe, did DNA testing, and he is 98% Ashkenazi Jew. He's like, I'm more Jewish than you are, I'm sure. And 1% Japanese and 1% Native American. And so, I mean, I should ask him, he's a genetic specialist, but I think it means that you have ancestors who are Jewish. Doesn't it mean that? Ashkenazi refers to Jews who came from Germany as opposed to, or Eastern Europe as opposed to Sephardi Jews would have come from Middle Eastern countries.
It's not the same as saying...
Use the microphone, please. Use the microphone, please. Thank you.
Okay. It's not the same as saying, well, you're 2.3% Mormon. Because Mormon isn't a race, it's just a religion.
Right. I mean, people always debate, is Judaism a religion? Is it a race? Is it a people? But Judaism, I mean, the fact that Ashkenazi Jew shows up in your DNA testing means it's different than just a religious belief. I mean, it's a set group of people. So I think if it says Ashkenazi Jew, I would side with you over your son. I don't think it just means German.
Okay.
Thanks, Darla. All right. So there are, I want to, whenever I try and do the thank yous, there's a couple more things I just want to say. It always falls really flat to end that way. So I'm going to just make a couple final comments, and then I'm going to have her read a passage, and then we're going to give her a warm Mormon Stories thank you for being with us today. But I just want to, there are a couple healers in the audience that I just want to acknowledge really quick. Jana Spangler, will you stand up? This is Jana. She's a coach, and she works with Natasha's Symmetry Solutions, but she does really great work. If anybody is looking for someone who can help them kind of through a faith crisis, Jana's here. And then Liz Dalton, will you stand up, please? Liz Dalton is a dear friend of our family's. She's a divorce mediator. She's an attorney, but also she mediates divorces to save you all sorts of expenses and costs. But in addition to that, she's very skilled at saving families and healing families. And she's been a really important part of our family. So I just want to thank you for being here, Liz, and acknowledge that. I also want to acknowledge Steve Holbrook. If you'll stand up with Chris. Steve is on the board of directors of the Open Stories Foundation, and Chris, why don't you stand up too? They've been really important supporters of the Open Stories Foundation. We wouldn't exist without our board. And Steve, I didn't mention you in the opening, so I just wanted to thank you guys for being here and tell you we love you. I appreciate that. Okay, I want to thank everyone for joining us, for coming. We flew Tova out. We didn't know if people would come. We did a ton of work, Amy and Sharon, to make this possible. And it's just so deeply meaningful to fill this room. So for everyone who came, who bought the books, I just want to give you applause for coming. Thank you so much for coming. It means the world. I sandbagged with Tova. I'm like, I think 20, 30 people are probably going to be here. I told her what is it? Under promise and over deliver. So again, Amy and Sharon, thanks for making this event possible. So I'm going to close having you read kind of a longer section, but it was Margie's favorite. I think I got it right. It was Margie's favorite part of the book, and I really loved it too. And I think it's a great way to end. So maybe here to the end, and you'll see what it is when I hand it to you. But maybe you can set it up a bit.
Sure.
And then we're going to end by Tova reading. She can provide any commentary, and then we're going to give her our warm thank you. And while you're checking that out, email us at mormonstories@gmail.com. All of you who donate to the Open Stories Foundation, you make this possible. Literally, our staff, our work, the podcast, the events. Thank you so much to everyone who donates to the Open Stories Foundation. If you don't support us, we welcome you to please consider a monthly donation. It makes all this possible, and we're going to just spend the rest of our years trying to support people in transition and to heal and to bring joy to the earth. So thanks to everyone who does support us. If you don't support us, please do consider. So with that, Tova, do you want to sort of set this up and then give us your final reading?
Sure. So this is towards the end of the book. As I mentioned, my sister got married over the course of the year the book takes place in. And, for my parents, it was sort of like, should we talk about the wedding or the divorce? They're kind of going on simultaneously. And but this is watching my sister get married in Israel in an Orthodox world, and knowing that it was a world I got married in, but at this point was no longer part of. Even after all these years, I still wish I could go back in time and call to my younger self before her betrothal documents were signed, or catch her eye as she was being reminded about how the bride has a direct line to God, before she sets off down the aisle, a white flower wreath in her hair, her face covered with a pearl-studded veil that makes everything appear blurred and soft. I want to whisper warnings to her, to be the evil fairy who comes uninvited to the festivities, bringing not happy blessings, but ugly truths from the future. I want to open her eyes and ask her if she is sure, really sure. Gently remind her that life doesn't always turn out the way it's supposed to. Tell her she can wait longer until she is more sure of who she is. Awaken her curiosity about the other choices that will await her if only she could live with the unknown. And if she won't listen to these gentle warnings, because of course she won't, then I will hold back nothing. Be relentless and brutal. Show her the artifacts from the future, her red-rimmed eyes and her arms that she squeezes tightly in order to keep herself intact, and the stunned look on her children's faces when she pulls aside the coverings on their lives. I will tell her she will have to bear the pain on 3 young faces that she will love more than anything she could yet imagine. I will tell her of the anger held in for too long that will come spewing forth. Tell her she will be accused of not trying when she is exhausted from years of trying. Tell her she will know she is doing this to save herself, but even so, there's a price to pay, and she must be willing to pay it again and again. That in the end, after dividing everything of the marriage, she will have to bear all the blame. Tell her this is a story that will divide her life in 2, a story she will carry with her always. Tell her this is a story she will want to tell, need to tell, but first she will be able to have to face it herself. The Sheva Brachot, the 7 marriage blessings, are being recited now, but my mind is spinning, and I think not of the words praising God who created the groom who rejoices in his bride. Instead, I think of the Sharon Olds poem, I Go Back to May 1937, hardly good wedding material, about her parents' disastrous marriage. I want to go up to them and say, stop, don't do it. She's the wrong woman. He's the wrong man. You are going to do things you cannot imagine you would ever do. Sharon Olds wrote, I still want to go up to her, my bridal self, and plead with her one last time. Please, you are barely 23, so much younger than you realize. Please, you know so little of the world. You know so little of yourself. The sound of broken glass returns me to this wedding, to now. My sister who has waited, who knows herself, is married, and her face is shining, and she and her husband are holding hands and dancing down the aisle. And the people around are calling out Mazel Tov. And I am sitting here, happy to be in this moment at this time. But I don't do it. I want to live, concludes Sharon Olds. I look down at my daughter sleeping in my lap, the softness of her cheek, the rise and fall of her breath, my boys next to me, prodding each other, whispering and smiling, looking mischievous, even when dressed in their wedding clothes. I shake myself from all this backward looking. It's true, I didn't heed my own voice when I was younger. I waited too long to recognize my doubt. But it's time to acknowledge to myself that the only way to have learned all this was to pass through it. Do it anyway, I tell that bride. Walk down that aisle. Thank you.
Let's give Tova a warm Mormon Stories. Thank you.
Thank you all so much.
You've been a blessing not only to your people, but to ours.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. Thank you. Thank you all. I just wanted to say, in having this book come out for all the fear of exposure and vulnerability, I truly feel that the most moving experience has been the Mormon Stories podcast and the emails I've gotten from so many people, that sense that you can be from presumably such a different world and that there's so much connection. And I think those, for all the weirdness of the past few months for me, those emails and the comments on the Mormon Story podcast, I think it fills that loneliness, that sense of being the only one to have a story, when you realize how many people share that same story and travel that same path. So thank you all so much.
Thank you, Tova. And thank you so much. And if you want Tova to sign your book, she will be staying around for the next 30 minutes or so, and you guys are welcome to come talk to her, meet her, and have her sign your book. Thank you, everybody. Love you so much. Join us again on Mormon Stories. Take care.